Welcome to Crossing Faiths. I'm John Pinna, and today we have a really interesting guest, a longstanding colleague and friend. We're joined with Dr. Sahar Khamis, a force in the Arab Muslim media, in the Arab Muslim medium scholarship, and someone who has been in the room on the front lines with digital discourse and which became a tool for protest, persuasion, and yes, power. She's in the department chair in Qatar, a visiting professor for the University of Chicago, and now she's shaping national conversations in the U.S. From Montgomery County's Human Rights Commission on the airwaves of Arab American radio. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you so much, John. It's a pleasure to be with you.
No, it's longstanding and long coming. We've been colleagues and sort of friends in each other's orbit, but we've never interacted. I think together. We haven't interacted together in a long time since I deployed out to Afghanistan in, was it 2014, 2015? But we were on the dais together recently, about a month ago, talking about democracy and Islam. And that was when we kind of had this sort of instant chemical reaction of, we know each other? And then we finally got back together. So I appreciate you coming on board and spending some time with us.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
So I mean, let's just jump into it. I mean, you are, digital guru. You're an intellectual and academic. You've been involved in hefty events, the Arab Spring, and numerous events in the MENA region. And I wanted to bring you on board because when it comes to the double-edged sword that affects social media platforms for the spreading of, counterterrorism, but also Islamophobia and other narratives. How do you balance this double-edged sword of advocacy, and then on top of that, the narratives that attack individuals and people's cultural peoples, when it comes to Islamophobia?
Yeah, I mean, digital media and social media definitely have a double-edged sword effect. That's for sure. I mean, when the internet started and people were talking about, that's great, amazing. Just give people the internet and they're going to have freedom. Just give people the internet and they're going to have democracy. The internet has this kind of liberating powers, right? Sure. And there was this moment of what we can describe as quote unquote techno euphoria. Definitely at the beginning or the outset of the Arab Spring, we were talking a little bit about that before we started recording this podcast. There was this moment of everybody, intellectuals, academics, activists, journalists, people on the ground, you name it. Everybody is like, yes, people are making it. The Arab world is being liberated and we have these great revolutions and the Arab Spring is changing things and there is never going to be a turning back. So I remember at one point I was giving this talk at the Woodrow Wilson Center in the Middle East program, and I was giving this talk, and after I finished, the director said, Dr. Khamis, you don't think you're a little bit upbeat? And that was in 2011 at the outset of the Arab Spring and the Egyptian Revolution. I was like, no, I'm not I'm not upbeat. This is really happening and this is great. Now, so many years later, I look back and I say, yeah, I think I was a little bit upbeat, We were all upbeat because we were really taken into this kind of moment of euphoria. And of course, social media played a very important pivotal role in the midst of these uprisings in shaping these uprisings and paving the way for them, for sure. But to say that the uprisings would not have happened had it been for social media not being there, I think that is a bit of an exaggeration. That is a bit of, what we call technological determinism, which means basically that you are over-crediting social media and new media with too much credit, right? Because at the end of the day, it's people on the ground who actually make the difference. It's people on the ground who go out and protest and put their lives at stake and are ready to take a bullet or to be harassed or to be detained and arrested. If it was not for their courage and bravery, no revolution will ever happen. Now, fast forward, we discovered the hard way that social media can also be a double-edged sword, just like it can be tools for liberation, for moving forward towards democracy. They can pretty much be tools also in the hands of dictators and autocrats in order to crush revolutions and uprisings and crack down on activists and protesters, creating new phenomena such as digital authoritarianism, which I've been writing about recently or lately, talking about how these very same social media and digital media tools are changing from tools of liberation to tools of repression and authoritarianism. And of course, with one major difference we should be aware of here, that back in 2011, when these revolutions started, the activists and the protesters, the young people, they had the lead. They were the ones who were actually leading. They were many steps ahead of the regimes in terms of the cyber game. Now the
Sure.
regimes are building their own cyber capacities and their own cyber and technological nuance and their own cyber know-how and their own capacities. So now they're able to use these very same technological tools to repress and to crush and to suppress protest and activism. And that is the phase that we are in right now. And therefore, we can rightly speak about social media and digital media being a double-edged sword.
No, it's interesting because now you can actually write in your own algorithms. You can actually establish predictive modeling. You can track people down, right? And before, I see in the beginnings, like 2009, 2010, 2011, I remember stuff like the Online Activism Institute and some of those things that I was heavily involved in, and I got very nervous. I mean, the conversation we had before we started recording, I still carry a little bit of guilt with me because I know that we were doing all these things, and this was just one piece in the Arab Spring was the digital element. But then I go, what's the so what now? Because once people go out there, how do we support people? Because you have this sort of false sense that you're supporting movements, but it's digital, so you're remote. You can't actually you're not boots on the ground. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about that nexus between the digital support and then the actual the boots on the ground that are actually protesting. You were just mentioning brave individuals. How does that work now, and what's the environment now? How does it play? Because the governments do have troops, they do have police, they do have that, so they have the force on the ground while there's these people remote supporting movements.
Yeah, thank you for raising this point, John. This is a very important point, actually. And that merits a podcast all by itself, actually.
Sure.
This is transnational repression. And now we have this phenomena, like people are escaping or going away or moving away from their home countries because they're afraid of the retaliation and the repression and, the regimes going after them and going after their families and loved ones, right? But even in the diaspora, even when they are activists, they are vocal against authoritarian regimes from the diaspora, that doesn't make them always 100% safe. There are still times when they will put themselves in harm's way. There are times when they're going to still be chased after by their own regimes with very tragic and very sad results. We have seen what happened, for example, to, Jamal Khashoggi, the very famous, Saudi critic who was also a US resident, who was also a Washington Post columnist, and, the very tragic ending. And we always cite his example because he is famous, or in this particular case, the incident is infamous. But it's not the only one. I assure you, it is not the only one. And what does that mean? It means that, yes, there is now transnational repression, there is transnational suppression and authoritarianism, and that even those who are protesting, those who are vocal, those who are outspoken in the diaspora are not always necessarily safe. And that is very sad and that is very concerning. Also, there is another very important point, which is when you are an activist in the diaspora, probably the most important tool, maybe the only tool you're going to use is going to be digital activism, or what we call cyber activism, right? But this cyber activism, as we agree now, has its own pros and cons, has its own strengths, but also has its own limitations. And one of the limitations is it does not trickle down always to the wider grassroots level, because not everybody has access to 24/7 high-speed internet. There is a digital divide between the technological haves and technological have-nots. Those in the cities, those in remote areas or villages or remote towns, Bedouin communities, you name it, do not have access to 24/7 high-speed internet. So in many cases, those in the diaspora have a problem with the trickle-down effect, that their activism does not trickle down sufficiently to everybody in their home countries. And another very important point, they're looked at as preaching from their safe haven in Arlington, Virginia, or Washington, D.C., or Toronto, Canada, or Australia, and they're not really there on the ground joining their own people, their own folks. And therefore someone in Egypt or someone in another country will say, hey, wait a minute, you're living in the comfort and safety of your own home in a beautiful suburb in Arlington, Virginia, and you're telling me to go out and put myself in harm's way. Why don't you try to come down and join me instead? So there is this kind of divide also between those who practice activism at home and those who try to practice it from the diaspora. And these are some of the real obstacles and challenges and limitations of doing activism from the diaspora.
Yeah, have you noticed in the diaspora, sometimes my great grandfather left Afghanistan in 1896. So my first language was Indo-Greek. So I speak a really old dialect of Indo-Greek, right? So when I go back to Afghanistan, people say, "Oh my God, he must be a country bumpkin. He must be from the middle of nowhere." But also, there's mindsets that are frozen in time, like that language, right? Because I learned it from my great grandfather. And so have you encountered when there's online activism and it's diaspora, sometimes it's the idea of the politics are frozen in the time when the diaspora left. So I always take a good example is like the Iranians in 79 that have left, their Iran is frozen in time in 79 and before. And a lot of them haven't interacted with Iran on the boots on the ground sort of level, even though there might be communication back and forth. Does that affect the advocacy?
Absolutely, absolutely, definitely. I mean, I always give credit to people who engage in any form of activism of any sort, of any shape, of any form, because let's face it, they're always putting something at stake. They're
Sure.
always, putting themselves in harm's way to one degree or another, in some form or another. That is just a reality. However, when you are in the diaspora, like we said, there are certain limitations. Definitely. The way people look at you, that you are not with them on the ground, limits your impact and your effect. And absolutely, like you rightly mentioned, now you can very much indeed be frozen in the Iran of 1979 or Egypt of 1952 or even Egypt of before 1952, the time when we had, a king rather than a president and all of that. So the reality is there are certain powers, there are certain potentials, but there are also definitely certain weaknesses and limitations which curb or limit the impact of those who are exercising activism in the diaspora. That's for sure.
I appreciate that input because I encounter that a lot, and I'm always trying to say is like because people want to restore a golden age, and that time may have passed, and that's always very tough because the uncertainty of what a future is. For example, the outcomes of the Arab Spring can be scary, can be frightening, right?
Yes.
When it comes to sort of the evolving nature of social media platforms, a lot of it's for entertainment, like Instagram and TikTok, but now they're becoming the source of information, and they're becoming sites for resistance and mobilization. You're one of the few people on the planet that can talk to the sort of beginnings of the sort of cottage stage of social media and digital advocacy to where it is now. Like so we know where we're at right now with TikTok and Instagram. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how sort of the good, the bad, the ugly of these platforms now that we have now, and how it's changed a little bit from its beginnings.
I'm so glad you raised this point, John, because it's very interesting. One time I was teaching my class on mediated communication. It's a course at University of Maryland, and I asked the students, where do you do most of your political conversations and engage in political discussions, right? And as someone who wrote the book Egyptian Revolution 2.0, Political Blogging, Civic Engagement, and Citizen Journalism, my mind is still, to your point, right?
Yeah.
Somehow trapped in the blogging moment when the bloggers were the activists on social media
Right.
and blogs were the hot buzzword of the day. And to
Right.
my surprise, these young folks said, oh, we do that stuff on Instagram and we engage in these discussions on TikTok. And I was like, excuse
Right.
me? Because in my mind, these platforms are just simply for entertainment, amusement, video clips, lip syncing, dancing, all of the light-hearted amusement. And I
Right.
never thought of them as a place where people are going to engage in some sort of serious political discussions. But
Right.
that is shifting and changing. In fact, I have an article I'm going to share with you right after the podcast. Feel free to share it with your audiences if you feel it is relevant to our discussion. And it's
Sure.
about the changes in TikTok and how it became a platform from girly dance to feminism and feminist activism, and how women who are, anti-hijab in Iran are using TikTok, right? The hashtag,
Yeah.
world, women life freedom, and also hashtag Mahsa Amini, and those who are pro-hijab asking France to just leave them alone with hashtag hands off my hijab. Both
Right.
of them are using, the same digital media and social media platforms. In this case, applications such as TikTok, right, and Instagram, which depend a lot on the audiovisual, on the
Right.
video content, on the audiovisual to get their message across. So they're focusing on photos, images, videos, video clips, all of that stuff to get the message across. And they're using it in different ways, depending on which side of the story or which side of the fence you are on. Whether you are fighting for your right to wear the hijab in a country like France, that has a heavy-handed approach to hijab and niqab, which is the full face veil, and they're saying hands off my hijab, literally, putting their hand like that and saying hands off my hijab. You don't touch my hijab. You have nothing to do with it. That's my freedom. And if France is about freedom, that's my freedom. And then you have the women in Iran who's like, stop. The government cannot tell us what to wear
Sure.
and what not to wear. They cannot interfere. They cannot be our guardians. They cannot dominate our lives. Leave us alone, right? So here, the hashtag Hair for Freedom and hashtag Women Life Freedom and hashtag Mahsa Amini, the young woman, of course, who tragically died at the hands of the so-called quote unquote morality police, whatever that means. So that
Right.
again, shows you how these very, very lively, interesting discussions are unfolding where on Instagram and TikTok, these platforms that used to be only for light-hearted entertainment and amusement. That is very interesting.
Yeah, and the production is what I'm an old man, right? So I'm in my 50s. But back in the day, you used to have a production team. You used to have the cameras and all this other stuff. Now you could produce videos by just downloading an app, and you can use your phone, and you can make production quality and edit and do everything yourself or with a small group of people, and that quality has changed and changed that dynamic. Maybe speak a little bit to that about how the accessibility of tools has enhanced advocacy.
100%. This is a very, very important point, and thank you again for bringing it up. Because indeed, to your point, right, in the past, oh, you need a $1 million studio in order to hire, sound engineers and production engineers and directors and videographers and all of these folks. Now, all you need is your laptop, right? Just the laptop we are using to record this podcast, or
Sure.
maybe in some cases, just your cell phone,
Sure.
right? And that can be your studio.
Yeah.
Right? When I do some media interviews now, they just send me a link which is called Quick Studio,
Yeah.
right? So you click on the link, you're there, you're in the studio, everything looks very natural as if you are actually in the studio itself. And what does that mean? It
Yeah.
means that you are shifting from the domination of a few handful of mainstream media that used to dominate the story. They tell us
Right.
what issues are important, what to think about, how to think about it. We all know the famous agenda setting theory, right?
Sure.
That the media can set the agenda for people and tell them what to think about. If I keep talking about climate change every single day and I am a big channel, then people are going to start to talk about it as well, and vice versa. If I ignore the issue, it's not important anymore. Now the narrative is changing and the situation is changing because you are seeing young people with very, very, very little budgets creating their own at home studios, literally doing their own podcasts, just like the one we are recording now, right? Doing their own videos, doing their own YouTube channel outcome, their own blogs, their own narratives, their own, content, and just producing that and having an audience on social media who tune in to their own videos. And I've been watching this phenomena unfold with a big smile and sometimes a bit of a surprise or even sometimes a frown because, the John Stuart Mill idea of the free marketplace of ideas, right? But
Sure.
sometimes you see on the market some stuff which is useful, some stuff which is okay, and some stuff which is just simply lies, misinformation, disinformation, completely fake, and totally disastrous. And all
Right.
of that is really being exchanged in this cyberspace with people shopping around, but not always having the quote unquote media literacy skills to be able to distinguish between truth and lies or between facts and fiction. And that's a very important point. Media literacy, very simply put, means how do you have the tools and the skills and the ability to distinguish what is true, real news and what is completely false, lies, fake, misinformation, disinformation, and so on. And we need, in my opinion, to teach even young kids, very young kids, right? From K to 12, that there is something which is called media literacy. How can you use social media responsibly? How do I know that this is a red flag? Don't go to this particular site. It's a fake site. This is human trafficking. This is child trafficking. This is pornography. This is a terrorist group trying to recruit people online. There is all sorts of stuff happening out there. And yes, there are also some good things happening, but you have to be very careful how you navigate this space.
Yeah, being judicious is difficult because on the one hand you have all this access, right? So someone can go with their phone and they can actually, geotag and shows that something's happening that's terrible, and they bring it to the forefront and it becomes news. But in the same respect, you also can have very, bad actors doing whatever production they want to do to actually recruit people. It's a strange environment, and you also could could be suffering from psychosis. You're not living in the real world. So then you turn around and you seek out the sources that affirm what you believe that might be terrible.
Thank you. And that's a very important point because what happens oftentimes on social media is that people create their own bubbles, their own echo chambers, right? So they're not the least interested in hearing you or even interacting with you or communicating with you if you don't share their exact same world view. So in
Sure.
order for me to talk to John, John has to exactly mimic my thoughts, my ideas, my principles, my values. Otherwise, it's my way or the highway. I don't want to even have this conversation. Bye bye. And that
Yeah.
is very dangerous because what I found in a lot of my writings and my research on social media is that unfortunately, the hoped for middle ground of digital, deliberation and critical discussion, the Habermasian idealistic public sphere where people respect each other and they have, middle ground deliberation, that doesn't exist. People
Yeah.
either live in their own ivory towers, their own bubbles, their own echo chambers, and I'm only gonna follow you, like your posts, repost it, reshare it, retweet it if you share my identical worldview, or I'm gonna shut you out, block you completely, or even in some worst cases, smear you and try
Sure.
to launch an attack on you and create some kind of character assassination and tarnish your image and reputation using the very same digital tools. So that is a very serious phenomena. And this absence of the middle ground of well-informed dialogue and deliberation is very serious, but it's also very true.
Well, and here's the thing: you never know who's going to be an influencer, right? So it's happenstance. You could want to be the influencer. You can try to be an influencer. You can do all kinds of things, but you never know who's going to be elevated to that level because I'm not sure there's maybe, and you would know better than I do. I think it's all by accident. It's all kind of what trends or kind of how something hits or how something is appealing or production value. But Mr. Beast is a good example. He's somebody that would have got involved, or even Joe Rogan got involved in podcasts is really at a very early stage, and now both of those gentlemen are elevated, and now they're advocating on issues where they may or may not be well versed on, and so they're I learned this term maybe, admittedly, maybe about a year ago. So the term is called platforming. I had no idea what that meant. So they're talking about how they're platforming people who may not maybe pushing conspiracy or might be pushing falsehoods or might be pushing stuff, and that's just because they're sort of in areas that they don't know enough to say I shouldn't platform this person. But then you get into that other side of like you're stopping freedom of speech, right? So like on the other side of that. So maybe you could speak a little bit about how influencers come to be, and then the power they have to kind of push things in and nudge things in different directions, or just very directly push things in different directions.
Yes. Do you have a cat at home, John? Do you
I
have
have a,
cats?
I don't have a cat. I have a dog, and I get in
Okay.
arguments about whether or not,
Okay.
as a Muslim, I should have a dog. But he has a duty, which means he's okay. He's,
Okay, the reason I'm asking this strange question in the
yeah,
midst of this conversation, which seems like completely out of context, is because I've seen people literally posting short, cute videos of
yeah,
their pet, their
yeah,
cat, or in the, if you want to have a dog, their cat or their dog, and then they get 1 million views
sure,
online, and people are commenting, and this is so cute, and this made my day, blah, blah, blah. And then you see some academic, right? Say making a very important point, or giving a very important lecture, and nobody cares, right?
right,
If this person gets like 1,000 views, they will be super, super, super lucky. And
sure,
I love cats. I have no problem with pets. I don't have one, but if I had one, I would have had it on the podcast now in order to increase the viewership
right,
and give us more visibility and outreach, right? But to answer your question of who becomes an influencer, it is not really about how much you know about the topic, or
sure,
whether you are the expert in the field, or whether you are this academic who has all of these credentials. Who cares? I just
yeah,
want to turn on my phone and watch these cute little, pets playing together, and two cats, jumping and dancing, and then there is a little music in the background, and that gets the million views. Now, once somebody becomes an influencer, whether it's because they're a makeup artist, or whether they're a model, or whether they have cute cats, or even a cute baby that they are
sure,
showing all the time on social media, then they can talk about anything.
right,
So the owner of this beautiful cat, or the mother of this cute baby, can then get on social media tomorrow morning and tell you what they think about Middle East peace,
sure,
and how to resolve this, very stubborn conflict that has been going on for years, right?
sure,
Or, what community engagement is all about, and how can we become a better community. And I'm like, ma'am, I appreciate you. I appreciate your beautiful, cute daughter. Very cute. I love watching her nice videos, but that
sure.
does not make you an expert on politics, social relations, community engagement, Middle East peace, and the list can go on and on and on. So, this whole idea of how influencers are created on social media, how they get this kind of persona, right?
Right.
How they get this kind of followership. And then what does that mean for online and social media discourse? That's a big question.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult. I remember I have this image of Jordan Peterson getting online and saying, Muslims, you need to get your act together. And I'm going, I scratch my head and go, what is he doing? And it was because he has a platform, he has influence. And he was basically saying, we all need to get our act together as Muslims. And I'm thinking, does he realize like we're we're a complex community that's diverse,
We're
that you're
2
not.
billion.
Yeah, 2 billion. And so, so for and I don't mean that to devalue or to devalue or to sort of denounce his subject matter, but he's a psychologist, and so the problem is he has this audience, and then is delving into these other areas, and to experiment is fine, and to engage is fine, but then with some authority to try to tell an entire population what to do, as if it's just something that we haven't even considered, you know. And so it was one of those moments I go, oh my god. But I think the challenge is like no one knows who's going to be an influencer, no one knows who's going to be able to speak on the issues. But once they have the population to engage, then that means that they have sort of a responsibility, and it's very different than when I grew up, and you had these sort of these anchors, and these that had ethics and rules, all kind of uh, and also colleagues that would, and a corporation that would impose rules on them. Now you might have people, like you said, that don't have training, that don't understand the issues, but have a following that can weigh in on the issues. And so it's part of that double-edged sword of how influencers can actually be a component for good, and also a component for confusion and disruption.
And let me just jump in here very quickly, John, and say that even in the religious domain, not only in the political domain, even in the religious domain, you are seeing now new social media influencers, who are becoming, basically sheikhs, and they're becoming, religious authority on social media,
Yeah,
right? Some of them really have beautiful input. Some of them, I'm not sure if that is the best, religious advice you can possibly give. Some
right.
of the views are very misogynistic or very sexist, right? But they create this kind of followership again on social media. So it is also not shaping only the political and social spheres and political and social discussions and discourses on digital media and social media platforms. They're also shaping the religious platform. So I was just writing recently an article about
Yeah.
religious reform, right? This very, contested term, right? What is reform? What does it mean? And some of these people are presenting themselves as reformers, or we are trying to do some kind of reform. We're trying to come up with new ideas, right? And
Right.
they create their own persona online and on social media. Again, you don't know if they have the proper training. You don't know if they have the proper authority. You don't know if they have the proper scholarship. You don't know if they have the proper degrees which allow them to have this kind of religious authority and to give this kind of religious advice online to a large following. That is, again, a phenomenon that has its own pros and cons, has its own good sides and bad sides. Because, yes, it is good to have, young intellectuals online. It is good to have young people having somebody maybe giving them some kind of advice where they actually spend most of their day, which is on social media, right? But then the downside is, hello, do these people actually have the qualifications and always have the kind of knowledge which is actually proper, correct, accurate, and needed? This is
Yeah.
another question.
Yeah, there's also transparency, knowing what the agenda is. Like me, I have a website. When we have a platform, we have this, and if you want to know who I am and what I'm about, you can find out. And you want to know my family background. You want to know why I speak with the New York accent. You can learn all those things. The challenge is that a lot of these people have sort of an online persona, and there's nothing behind that, and you can't. There's so that you lose that transparency. And something that I always say was really, really there was a benefit of COVID was we had a lot of sort of zakaras. We had a lot of, female sort of imams online it was a benefit who are serving the community. And so that was a benefit of COVID, where you were platforming sort of women theologians that were able to conduct what we would call in America pastoral care online. And what a great moment in time that was. And what it is now. But the challenge is that we've gone to this next level of where people are claiming to be reformers, claiming to be sheikhs, claiming to be imams, and now they have a following, and they're basically telling people what is and what isn't Islam, or what is and isn't right, or how I should run my life, right? And so, like I was just talking about how I have a dog. I got hammered by and this is an actual sheikh that's in the UAE, and he said, you're not allowed to have a pet, you're not allowed to have a dog. And I go, oh, I was like, have you read the Quran? Have you seen the Sunnah and the Hadith? You can have a dog if he has a role. And then we kind of went into this whole dialogue, but
Mm-hmm.
his audience hammered me on it. They were just like, haram, this and that, blah, blah, blah. And I go, look, here's the deal. I'm a Smiley. We're Islam after hours, and why don't you just let that be the excuse, And so, but the challenge is that there's such an influence of individuals out there because they are a platform, and I don't want to say deplatform people, because I think that's a terrible term, and I think that's a terrible practice. But maybe this would be a really great way to kind of lead out, is to talk about how to be judicious when it comes to looking at influencers and different channels that may or may not be appropriate for gaining your information, your news, and guidance.
It all goes back again full circle to the concept of media literacy that I mentioned before, and which I feel very strongly and passionately about, right? With people spending hours and hours and hours a day on their phones, myself included, with a lot of guilt, I have to admit that, right? What are we consuming? And what are we watching? And what kind of content are we actually exposing ourselves to, right? So, even me as a professor of communication, and I know what is misinformation, what is disinformation, right? Sometimes I can fall in the trap of just forwarding a video, right, without necessarily checking the source. And
Right.
then my father will say, where is the source of this video? And I'm like, oh my God, Now I'm ashamed of myself because I teach that stuff to my students, that you have to check your source and you have to check more than one source to verify the accuracy of the information that you are sharing before you share it with others. So that is very serious. That's why I'm saying we have to educate the young people, the young generation, because they are the ones who spend the most amount of time on social media. They can benefit a big deal. I mean, there are some stuff which can be really beneficial. Information at your fingertips,
Yeah,
right? You can Google any information, although I always tell my students, be careful because Professor Google is not always 100% accurate. Can be
right,
85% accurate, but not 100% accurate. So you have to double check. But the accuracy and the speed and the affordability and the accessibility with which you can get information is now amazing, and it's going to become even faster and faster as we move into the new phase of AI, artificial intelligence, again bringing its own baggage of good and bad to the table, because it does have a lot of advantages. It's going to be a big revolution in education, in engineering, in medicine, in many, many things, but it also brings its own challenges as well in terms of, the deep fakes. I can now have you, instead of having this kind of background behind you, you're now in Paris,
sure,
standing in front of the Eiffel Tower, right? You're doing the interview with me while you are actually in Paris, and your friends go, "Oh, Jean, we didn't know that you're actually in Paris. What are you doing in Paris? You never told us that you're going there." Right?
right,
So in fact, you never left your living room,
yeah,
right? And so on. So again, this new phase and the new era of AI, which is now really imposing itself on us. A lot of universities, including University of Maryland, where I teach in the Department of Communication, is now starting an artificial intelligence institute, a whole institute with new faculty, new, grants, potentials, abilities, in order to explore this new phenomena of AI and its many, many diverse phases and faces and effects and implications, and what it can possibly bring to the table, and the mixed effects it can possibly have on our lives, both positively and negatively. So really, when you're exposing yourself to digital media and social media, you have all of these different benefits, but also all of these different threats and dangers. And one big danger is also addiction to social media, which is a real issue. I know many people reach the point of addiction and you feel fatigue. You don't feel you have the energy to do anything. It affects you physically, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, more than you can imagine. So much so that there are now specialized centers for the treatment of social media addiction. I've seen a whole documentary on CNN. It was about this particular point. They take the young people in this particular place, and it's just like, when you isolate someone so they cannot have access to
yeah,
drugs. In
totally,
the case of drug addiction, they're doing the same thing, but they take away your devices. You cannot have access to
right,
laptop or screen or your mobile phone. Your cell phone is taken away. Everything is taken away from you, and now you have to communicate with other humans, face-to-face communication. Go out and take a walk, go
right,
and visit family, walk your dog, go to the swimming pool, enjoy a walk in the park, but
right.
don't spend any screen time. So these are all very big issues that are really brought upon us now, and they brought with them a lot of new opportunities, but also a lot of great and big challenges.
Oh, I think it's. I mean, it's going to evolve and it's going to go crazy, with AI, and who knows what's behind AI? We don't really know. But I appreciate you taking the time. It means a lot for you to share your thoughts and kind of dig into the topics a little bit. And I hope to have you back to get into a little bit more in depth about some of the topics, the Arab Spring, and some of the other things that we mentioned earlier.
Thank you so much, John. Let me just end by adding one more
Sure.
thing, please, before we
Yeah.
close, which is we started by talking about the digital media and social media
Yeah.
double-edged sword effect when it comes to issues like political movements, revolutions,
Yeah.
right? The Arab Spring. I also want to end by saying when we talk even about an issue like Islamophobia, which could be defined as the exaggerated and irrational fear of Islam and Muslims, social media and digital media also plays the very same double-edged sword effect. It can become a platform or platforms where Islamophobes can spread their own messages of hatred, discrimination, profiling Muslims, name calling, you name it, the list can go on and on and on. But it also provides great and unique opportunities for those Muslims to push back against the narrative and to create their own counter discourses and counter narratives, and to push back against Islamophobia using the very same digital tools and social media tools. So this is a very important thing to also bear in mind, and I think it blends very nicely with our conversation. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.